My name is Alexia Rauen. I am the co-executive director of Advocates for Immigrant Survivors. We are a nonprofit organization here in Houston, Texas, and we provide immigration legal services and social services to survivors of crime.
Well, thank you for agreeing to talk to me today about the uh, article you and some other people were involved in called Experiences of Immigrant Survivors of Violence and Law Enforcement. So just briefly, could you give us an idea of where this article came from? What was the origin of it? And then we'll get into some of the specifics.
Sure. So when I co-founded this organization, I'm with one of my co-authors, Sarah Bryan. It was back in 2019, and we were doing a lot of research about, what exactly were immigrant survivors' experiences. And we were finding that the data that we were able to collect was coming from attorneys or it was coming from advocates, social workers, right? And so for us, we wanted to really hear from the survivors themselves. So we partnered with Samantha Chapa. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Houston. And we came up with this idea to have her really run the interviews and kind of, we knew anecdotally what our clients were telling us, but we wanted to have an anonymous study performed in which we were not interviewers, we were not the ones involved, in which an academic kind of took the lead there. So we could really get uh, as genuine, experiences that folks were willing to tell us about. So that's really the origin of this article, and the origin of this research was trying to hear from survivors themselves.
Well, and I know when you get an academic involved, there are a whole slew of certain hoops you have to jump through, even to talk to anybody. So could you talk to us about some of the things that you intentionally undertook to make sure that people you reached out to were felt safe and anonymous and weren't put under pressure of any kind? And I
Yes.
really like the idea of the civically engaged research model that you guys took under. So if you or took on, would you talk a little bit about that too?
Sure. Yeah. So when we connected with Samantha, we told her, we want to be as involved as we can be within appropriate boundaries for our clients. Um, Ultimately, I have no idea who actually participated in this study. And we had the University of Houston Institutional Review Board approve this study. And so they gave us some parameters in terms of who we could share the study flyer with. So we had, I think, two other kind of like big collaborative agencies we could share the study with. And so I do think that a number of participants probably didn't even come from our organization. But we made it very clear, and we had a script that we had to follow that explained in participating, we're not going to know, right? Like, I'm going to have no idea if you participated, and it's not going to affect the legal services or the social services you receive from us at all. And we actually didn't collect any identifying information we didn't collect names, date of births, anything that could really identify anyone. And we gave them instead like a three, and again, I wasn't actually part of this part, so I'm just trying to remember exactly what Sam told me, but it was a 3-digit number, I believe. And so they were told, if you want to withdraw your data later, contact us with this 3-digit number because we're not going to know whose data it is, because it was done over the phone. The phone calls and any contact was deleted after. So we really tried as hard as we could to keep it as anonymous as possible. And we had folks reach out to us. So we never really contacted anyone directly. It was just survivors that reached out to our study team. And the goal behind that was we didn't want folks, A, to feel pressure, and B, if they were in an unsafe situation, because I do have a number of clients who are still living in, unsafe environments. And so we didn't want to be the ones reaching out to them. It had to be that they reached out to us, we scheduled it, or I didn't schedule, but it was scheduled at a time appropriate for them. I think they were called, once at the time. And then if they didn't answer, then we waited to see if they would get back in touch. But so all of that was really meant to protect the survivor. And then in terms of the civically engaged research, we had a lot of conversations. It took us a very long time to actually set up the study. A lot of back and forth in terms of like what questions we wanted to ask. So for my agency purposes, we really wanted to understand, what do they view as abuse? Are they seeking services like within the broader community? What services are they seeking? We did want to know about their interactions with police, but I would say even more so, we wanted to understand their interactions with the community as a whole. And I think for Miss Chapa, she was very interested in their interactions with law enforcement, but also were they willing to seek public benefits? Like, were they going to get SNAP benefits for their kids or not? And did that have any connection to their police involvement? Which is certainly very interesting. It's not necessarily like a goal of our organization. So there was also this kind of give and take in terms of the study questions. And then also having the study be like a reasonable amount of time. So I think that the studies were typically like around 45-minute interviews, but that can still be pretty long. So that was also a consideration of what is most important for us to ask. And ultimately, we generated a lot of data. So this article really focuses on the police involvement. I'm hoping that we can continue, well, we are continuing to interview folks. Obviously, there's a very different political climate than when we first did this. The study was done at the end of 2023. So I'm curious to see if that affects how folks respond to our questions. But yeah, I think it was a very collaborative effort, and I'm very grateful for just the amount of time that Ms. Chapa was willing to dedicate to this project.
Yeah, and let's get into a little bit of what you were asking people about, because as you said, there were kind of different aspects or facets to the work, and one was interactions with police. So when the migrant immigrant community calls the police, what that interaction is like. But then there's also this secondary question, which was how does that affect their ability or their willingness to engage in the political process and then also contact services if needed be. So,
Mm-hmm.
if you could talk a little bit about what you were trying to figure out and what was going on with the actual questioning.
Yes. I think we were really trying to determine, I think our hypothesis was positive interactions will potentially lead to more positive interactions or more willingness to contact government agencies. Negative interactions would lead to less likelihood of contacting. And I think that is ultimately what we discovered. I think we had some interesting observations specifically around gender. I found that quite interesting in our study. The male participants in our study really felt that they didn't maybe get great police response and that they really had to frankly, from when I read their responses, it seems like they had to prove the abuse a little more. Like they had to come with more evidence, maybe than other participants, to make law enforcement take the report seriously. For me, I also wanted to know in how many cases are law enforcement actually giving them resources. So that was another thing that we were looking at. But I do think that our overall hypothesis of these kind of like more positive interactions did ultimately equate to more willingness to interact more broadly with the government.
And most of the calls where people were requiring the police were for violence, either violent crime or domestic abuse, right? So could you unpack a little bit more about that? Because I found that fascinating too, about the male victims of domestic abuse and how they felt the police interacted with them.
Yes. Yeah, I think that primarily it was domestic violence survivors that were interviewed. Domestic violence, of course, is broad. And so I think for a number of folks, it's going to be intimate partner violence. But we certainly, I think there was some roommate violence that was also included in our study. But I really what the male survivors, they mentioned that they had to there was one survivor who said that he had to record the incident of abuse. And it seemed like for a number of survivors, they were having to report more than once. And so it wasn't just this incident of violence occurred, I called the police and I received services. It was I'm trying to get them to kind of listen to what I'm saying and take that report. So that was pretty startling to me. And then I think another thing I really took away was this idea that the language barriers. And so not just, we did have obviously clients that were Spanish speakers who had language barriers when talking to law enforcement, but even some of the English speakers, just kind of not understanding some of the terminology that's being used. For example, I think we had a survivor say that he didn't understand pressing charges. And so I guess if you're being asked to press charges and it's not being explained to you, then ultimately maybe you're not making the decision that you want to be making, right? Maybe you did want for an arrest to occur, that kind of thing. So I thought that was really interesting to me too, just this idea of language and vocabulary and knowing what are these terms that law enforcement's communicating with me.
Well, that was going to be my next question, which is the barriers that kind of came up through the study. And that was an interesting part that I thought too. It wasn't so much that the language provided the barrier, but it was they weren't educated on the legal process. And sometimes
Mhm.
nation of origin determined how they saw the police, and they assumed it worked the same here or didn't work the same here as it happened to be depending on the country. But could you speak a little bit more about some of the other barriers besides language, but some of the cultural barriers too that some of these immigrants brought to?
Mhm. Yes. So I think in a number of countries, it's not really a common practice to call law enforcement or to reach out to law enforcement. We did also see a number of abusive partners or abusers in these situations inform the participant that the police was capable of deporting them, that the police would be the ones taking them, deporting them, that the police might take their children. So there was a lot of misinformation being perpetrated that was impacting their willingness to ultimately contact police. Certainly cultural barriers, again, this idea that we don't contact police maybe in our home country, and so we're not going to do that here. Um, and let me see what other barriers that would be good to address. I mean, there were some positive interactions. There was some folks talking about wellness checks and this kind of positive interaction with law enforcement. But I do think we certainly did see this idea of maybe it's not something that we do in our country, and so would we be willing to do it here, and what would it look like here? Um,
There was one or two that were also where the individual was educated by police and then felt that the interaction changed halfway through. I think that was one of them, that they felt scared at the beginning.
mhm.
Police officer kind of explained the process, and then at the end, they had a positive outcome.
Yes, yes. Which is, I mean, ideally what we would like to have happen. Um, yes, I do believe that.
So I wanted to talk about, you mentioned the undocumented status, and sometimes the documented status of
Mhm.
migrants, and how that expressed as fear of police or concerns about deportation.
Yes. Um, so, I mean, I think one thing that really stood out to me was this idea that there is sometimes law enforcement, or at least one of the individuals in our study mentioned that law enforcement suggested that maybe this person contacted police in an attempt to get legal status. And I think that really has its roots in the U visa process, which is kind of mentioned throughout the paper. But the U visa is specifically a visa for folks that have been victims of serious crimes in the United States. There's a lot of misinformation about that process too. It's an incredibly long process. I mean, it can take over a decade. Right now, there's over 200,000 applications pending for that status. And really, the goal of that status is cooperation with law enforcement. So I think I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, but that really did the fact that there was one incident in which there was this question of like, are you wanting papeles or like legal status was really the implication there. And just how kind of disjointed that is from the reality of attempting to get legal status as a victim of crime. It's a very difficult and complicated and long process. But I do think that part of what we would like to see change is this misinformation about the role of police with deportation. It does, I think, depend on where the crime is being reported and what kind of cooperation law enforcement might have with federal immigration agencies. Um, so that wasn't maybe quite as pronounced in this paper, but it is something that I'm hoping in future iterations of the study we can explore more. But I do think just this general idea of abusers are providing information that's very false in the hopes of preventing the individual from seeking services.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that came out in the conclusions, right? You need to, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I'd like to take a small tangent because I was curious. You're bringing up this other type of visa. Um, I don't think we understand as a general public exactly what the immigration process is. And when
Mm,
we talk about immigrants, there are various stages of immigration and legality or, being near extra legal. Could you just kind of unpack that a little bit, just briefly, what your organization kind of does with those groups and what it means and how do you navigate that system? So I think that'd
yes.
be incredibly informative.
Yeah. So the bulk of what we do are filing applications with the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. And these are considered affirmative applications in which someone is like seeking a benefit from the government. And there are really three types of visas. I think for lack of a better word, we can stick with that. Um, One of the visas we work on is called the U visa. It's just named that because that's the letter under like the Immigration and Nationality Act code. But it is essentially a visa for folks who have suffered a serious crime in the United States, and there's a very specific list of crimes. For them to even apply for this visa, they need to have a form. It's called a certification signed by a law enforcement agency in the United States. And the form really says this person's been a victim of a crime and they're cooperating. And so the real motivation behind this visa is to encourage cooperation because when folks are victims of serious crimes and they're not willing to report, it really makes an unsafe community for all of us. And so that was the motivation behind that visa. Now, when that visa was created by Congress, they capped the number available per year at 10,000. And I mentioned prior, there's over 200,000 pending applications. So this wait just continues to get larger and larger. There is a possibility for a work permit while you're waiting. And so you can kind of enter the formal economy and start working with the Social Security and all those kind of things while the U visa is pending. But it is ultimately a very long process that folks kind of undergo. And sometimes they do have other forms of status. Maybe they're in student status. Maybe they are, on just like different types of employment visas, but they're pursuing this additionally. The next visa we work on quite a bit is called the T visa. It's a visa for victims of human trafficking specifically. Very similar to the U visa process, cooperation with law enforcement, all these kind of things. There just isn't the requirement of a certification at that point, although frankly, almost all the cases I file have a T visa certification from law enforcement. And that one's a quicker turnaround. The cap just isn't met, and so it's a faster process ultimately. And then the last one that I would say is really one of the big ones we work on is called VAWA, Violence Against Women Act. It's just kind of like how we cite in our lingo, but essentially it is very similar to a family petition. And so a family petition is I am a person with status, or I'm a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident and I have a qualified relationship with another person and I want to petition for that person. And so most commonly we see spouse, right? We have a US citizen who's married to someone perhaps without status and they're wanting to petition for that person. Now, when that US citizen or permanent resident is abusive, then they often hold that application maybe over the spouse. They say, yes, I'm going to file it. No, I'm withdrawing it. Kind of like this tool of power, really. And so we see that a lot. And so ultimately, the VAWA option permits that immigrant to file the application on their own without the involvement of the abuser. But they have to show all the same things. So they have to show that they entered into this relationship in good faith, which essentially is I didn't do this for immigration benefits. I did this, because I wanted to build a life with this person, because I had these dreams. So we have to show all the same things. We just also have to show this abuse or battery or extreme cruelty. So those are really the three visa types that we work on. And so it is all folks who have suffered some sort of violence, abuse here in the United States that are just seeking stability and are hoping to leave that abusive environment.
And most of these people are here, as you said, either on a different type of visa or are, for like illegal. Is that so who are filing for these?
Some folks are here with other types of status, whether it be student, employment, DACA, TPS, temporary protected status, and then a number of folks are undocumented. So they have no other status. Sometimes they came here with status and perhaps like overstayed a visa or that kind of thing. Sometimes they did come without status.
So I know this is an unfair question, but do you think that these programs are potentially going to be weaponized in the deportation move that we're seeing in this administration,
What would you mean by weaponized?
used against the people who are undocumented?
So I suppose, I mean, it's hard to kind of predict what's going to happen. Under the prior administration, there was a memo in place that essentially said to ICE, if you identify someone that's a victim of crime and maybe has a pending application for these benefits, consider that when you're making decisions. Um, I will say, if we're talking about someone who maybe has pretty extensive criminal history, the likelihood that one of these visas gets approved is lower, right? And so that might be a situation where that person is at higher risk of detention because of that prior criminal history, and this visa isn't going to potentially there's a waiver. So the U and the T visas both have waivers. VAWA can sometimes waive things, but I would say the U and T have more generous waiver. But it really is up to the government whether or not they're going to waive. It's criminal and sometimes like immigration violations. Um, I mean, by filing an application with the government, you are providing your information to them, and so that they will know where you reside, typically. So yes, that potentially puts you at more risk. But I would say, I mean, the majority of my clients are filing their taxes, right? They have the I-10 number. They're trying to be part of the formal economy and kind of part of their communities. And so that too, right? You're giving your information to the IRS in that case. Um, it's hard to know to what extent, we'll see kind of having these visas filed. I will say with the U visa specifically, if someone is deported while it's pending, they can wait out the time of the visa, wait for it to finish processing in their home country. And if it's approved, they can return on the visa. So that is also an option that I'm always kind of reminding my clients of, if something like this were to happen, there is that potential that you could re-enter lawfully with that visa at that point.
Thank you. I know that's looking into a crystal ball that is basically the color of a bowling ball, so it's not easy to do. Let's return to the study, which is so you had a very small sample, unfortunately, for people who participated. We go through some of the responses, though, of I think it was 17 or 19 people who participated. So because some of them were very interesting in how they answered some of the stats in the paper were very interesting. So if you could kind of walk us through some of that and then we can talk about it.
Are there any specifically like in the English speaker section or the Spanish speaker section, or which ones were you?
I think I was interested in kind of how, yeah, the different, let's go through the Spanish first, and then we'll go through the English, because there's some interesting things in both. So there were more English, right? But then five.
Mhm.
So let's go through the Spanish first.
Okay. Okay. So it seemed, I mean, I think we had, let me just scroll up and make sure I'm saying this correctly. Yes. Okay. So we had 5 Spanish participants. 4 of them felt safe interacting with law enforcement. Let me scroll back down. 3 felt respected, so that's generally very positive. 2 did feel angry and 2 did feel misunderstood. And then there was that one individual who felt at peace by reporting the abuse. So that's a very positive um, interaction. Um, One did report some feelings of racism and injustice, and that was the person who had kind of talked about feeling like, or the mention of legal status when the police responded to the scene. One Spanish speaker had prior experiences of reporting abuse that caused her to be fearful. Um, Yes. And then two had said that they had been previously afraid due to misunderstandings about the role of police. And then that turned around and they were able to feel more comfortable with the police. So that's a very positive interaction there as well. One said, if I wasn't undocumented, I wouldn't be afraid. And that's understandable. But yeah, three of five said that they would reach back out in the future to law enforcement. So that's I mean, it is a small sample size, but that is generally positive. And then I think this was also consistent with the English speakers, but Spanish speakers differentiated the role of police from the government at large. So they didn't say that, this negative interaction with police is going to impact how I interact more generally with the government. Um, Yes. Two did say that they were unwilling to seek public benefits, but that wasn't due to their interactions with the police. And then three said, if I am eligible, I might reach out for help. Um, so yeah, I mean, it seems the general takeaways were this idea that the fear could be overcome if they have that positive interaction with law enforcement. Um, and then the negative interactions are going to make them less likely to be willing to report in the future.
Yeah, I was surprised at the number of people who felt they had a positive interaction, which is good. I,
Mhm.
I'd expected, especially the Spanish speakers, to have a different outcome. But
Mhm.
Russian speakers were kind of a little bit more complicated in their reactions and some
Mhm.
takeaways. So let's talk a little bit about those guys.
Yes. Okay, let me see here. I mean, it seemed most English speakers generally viewed police positively or felt that police treated them positively. Three did say that they didn't feel that way, and so there was that segment that felt differently. Um, One felt like they had or stated that they were almost arrested during the incident, and two felt like they weren't believed. Um, mm, mm, mm. And then one kind of detailed all of the support. She got some pretty significant and great support from law enforcement, including those welfare checks. Um, Five said that they were afraid. Six said they were unafraid. So kind of a divided group there. One individual, like the Spanish speakers, kind of flipped, if afraid, and then that positive interaction led them to not be afraid. We had this survivor mention that it's not typical in Indian culture to contact police, so she didn't really understand what it was going to be like when she reported. Um, and those who were unafraid said, I'm unafraid because police are here to help. So that's a positive interaction there. Um, Two felt hesitant because they didn't know what it would be like. They feared children being taken away. I think that's a big one for folks. But now one of them said, I know my rights and I'd be more comfortable in the future. Five felt safe, six felt respected. So those are positive. Five felt angry. So kind of, right there on the other side. Um, and five of the English speaking participants said they weren't given any resources. So that's a disappointing one because typically law enforcement, I mean, at least they've got a pamphlet with them that they're supposed to hand out. Um, so that it is a bit disappointing not to receive any resources, especially because if you are able to access social services, then typically they can help you. Like, for example, we assist folks in reporting crime. We actually have an advocate who will go to the police station with survivors, especially for the Spanish speakers. They tend to want an interpreter to go with them. Um, so, and then most had positive or neutral opinions of the government as a whole, and then three had negative views. But I think that still shows, even if it's a complicated interaction with the police, there tends to be this distinction that they're making. Um, and then most participants indicated they would contact other government agencies if they needed that help. Um, I will say, I mean, typically, I mean, if an individual is undocumented, they're typically not eligible for any benefits as is. So any sort of benefits that they might receive wouldn't be for them. It would maybe be for like U.S. citizen children. Um, but at least in the state of Texas where we're located, there's not a lot of access to benefits for those that aren't permanent residents or citizens. Um, and then again, in our conclusions, we talked about the negative interactions did leave this like lasting negative impression, and then the positive, the opposite. So I think it'll be interesting as we try to get more data, especially, now, right, post this new administration to see if that continues, if that trend kind of continues.
And it'll be interesting to see too, if people aren't contacting the police, why they're not contacting. I mean, I think we probably know why they're not contacting the police in the current climate where it seems like everything is supposed to be reported in some fashion to immigration.
Mhm.
Something that just came out recently that I was talking to another person about detention and immigration and how some of the stuff that's been happening is incredibly problematic for reporting of crime, because you can be accused of a crime and then as a victim of a crime, but also perpetrating a crime, then that's what overrides any of your other rights.
Mhm.
It'll be interesting seeing if you get more people or what kind of interactions you have.
Mhm.
I think it's also worthy to note that these are interactions where these individuals contacted the police. So
Mhm.
the police, not the other way around. These weren't police stops. These were citizen calls to the police, right?
Yes. Mhm.
Well, anything else you'd like to add about the report or your work or what's going forward?
We're continuing. I mean, we're going to keep trying to get more folks to participate in the study because we would really like to have a larger sample size. I'm especially interested in kind of seeing, depending on where maybe the reports are taken, like geographically, because Houston's I mean, we're a huge city, kind of seeing if that has any impact on how people feel about reporting. Um, I think another thing I want to continue to look at is interpretation in reporting. This wasn't really addressed in our article, but there was mention in the data, at least, of like family members being the person to translate, especially minor children often serve as translators for our clients. And so that's something that, again, we're trying to help by sending a bilingual advocate. But obviously, we can't be on the scene when the police are called in all these kind of instances. But just kind of continuing to see what access to interpretation is there for folks. I'm hopeful that maybe we could even get some folks that are not English or Spanish speakers, because we have, a very diverse community here of individuals. And so it would also be very interesting to see what is it like if you're a Bengali speaker calling the police, or Urdu, or, any of these other languages where it might be harder for the police to find an interpreter. Um, but yeah, I mean, we're just going to continue to try to gather data. And then I think another thing would be kind of observing how changes in legal status. So we've had a pretty significant group of our clients get status, right? So they get their work permit, or now they're on their way to permanent residency. And so how has that changed from the initial filing of the application, where it's very uncertain, to now I have more, protections in the United States? How does that also impact their willingness? So I think that's something that we could see, as we continue to hopefully run iterations of the study, see that kind of change over time.